Well, welcome everybody to today's roundtable discussion, which is part of the Skoll World Forum's Ecosystem Day, which is a day of independently hosted sessions from the Skoll Network. Today's discussion is centered around a really exciting topic, which is putting trust-based philanthropy into practice. And our discussion is curated and hosted by IDE. I am Alix Lebec, the founder and CEO of Lebec Consulting. Very excited to moderate today's discussion with a really exciting group of panelists. And our discussion is really timely because, as we have seen, there has been a growing trend in philanthropy. And that has been centered around the urgency of stronger trust, particularly between funders and grantees, as well as stronger partnerships, and the urgency for long-term flexible philanthropic funding that is funding people and organizations instead of projects. And so, today's discussion is also very timely because, as many of us have met year after year, there is a statistic that hasn't really changed, which is that there is still a $2.5 trillion annual funding gap to solve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is further urgent as we have seen the latest findings of the IPCC climate report. And so the good news is that we know today that there are enough financial resources and ingenuity in the world to really avoid the worst of climate change and alleviate poverty. And we were excited to have this conversation today as well, because as we saw during the pandemic, unfortunately, nearly 300 million people fell back into poverty. And what was really interesting to see was how the philanthropic community responded. And in particular, we saw more and more philanthropists who really adopted this new ethos around trust-based philanthropy, which we have many times called unrestricted philanthropy. So today you're going to hear a discussion about how so many of us see trust-based philanthropy as an opportunity not only to help de-risk and demonstrate the huge potential between social enterprises and solutions to poverty, but also as a means of attracting significantly more institutional and impact investing capital, as well as governmental resources. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today to kick off our discussion, which starts with Pete Yao, who is the Chief Impact Officer at Thankyou, a corporate funder, Sheila Leddy, who is the program partner of Imago Day Fund, a grant-making organization, and then 3 global impact partners called Lizz Ellis, the CEO and founder of IDE. We have Shawn Holden Cheung, who is the CEO of Raising the Village, and Katie Bunten-Wamaru, who is the CEO of the African Visionary Fund. And so, Shawn, I'm going to start with you and ask you to share an example of how trust-based philanthropy enabled you to achieve something with Raising the Village that would have been very difficult if the only resources you had access to were restricted.
Yeah, I'm sure. Happy to open up the conversation, and thanks again for having me. At Raising the Village, we're really fortunate to have a great group of supporters for our work. And I'll never forget, one of our very early partners said to me, he says, "I don't really understand what you're trying to do here, and I'm not sure it'll work, but I believe in you." And so with that, that's how we set off as an organization. We partner with last mile ultra poor communities in looking to increase their household income. So we take a livelihoods lens where we provide basic needs and training to last mile communities with the aims of rapid improvement of household income. Now, the way that we do it is we look at the intersection of community-driven development and data analytics. So you can imagine, as an organization, we have 2 programmatic areas: inputs, agricultural inputs like seeds, livestock, training, infrastructure. And then the other side, which is technology, where we equip our frontline extension workers with advanced data analytics that help them optimize their work and allow for real-time decision-making. So this comes in the form of statistical analytics, outcome forecasting, GIS, imaging, and the like. But you can imagine how it would feel to write a proposal and which one would get a little bit more interest when it came down to it, is to say that try writing one about, a stat software that you need versus, providing these inputs and goods. So that's kind of where we have this tension and where we've been able to leverage our unrestricted grants and to be able to put into this in an investment. And with these type of tools, we've actually been able to increase the number of beneficiaries we've had. So maybe just even 6 years ago, we were at 2,500 beneficiaries. Fast forward to where we are right now, this year, we'll be working with 250,000 beneficiaries at 95% less the cost, because we've been able to use the technology that we've been building towards to find more efficient, more effective ways to work with communities. And so that's just one brief example about how we've been able to use that to unlock further impact.
That's fantastic. That's really, really helpful, Shawn. And do you find that in general, it's hard to get funders to be comfortable with trust-based philanthropy? I mean, in many of the conversations that you've had, is this still a difficulty, or are you seeing more and more funders who are open to this concept?
Well, I find that with some of our existing partners, they're actually a part of these groups that are. This is a part of the dialogue that's starting to occur. I think that as conversations happen between philanthropic groups, is that this kind of advances the conversation. But it's not to say that we still have to be a bit creative sometimes, and when it working out with some of the conversations we've had with folks.
Yeah, and I think this is a good pivot. Thank you, Shawn, for me to bring it to you, Pete, to weave in your perspective as a funder and why you feel that trust-based philanthropy really aligns with perhaps how Thankyou defines success in philanthropy, and why this approach is so valuable to the impact that you're trying to have in the world.
Yeah, thanks, Alix, and echoing Shawn's just gratefulness. So great to be here. So great to share this panel with you all. To maybe explain a bit about what we do, which helps to frame sort of our funding approach. We're a consumer product goods company, and so as a corporate funder, we're accountable, so to speak, to millions and millions of micro donors who invest into our organization because they love what we do and our ethos. And 10 years ago, we became an extreme poverty funder with a very restrictive lens. And so this pivot's only happened for us for the last 2 grant cycles in the last 2 years. And the reason we've done that, to your point around success, is we really, really feel the entire philanthropic sector, including us, the success metric and measure should always be underserved communities and whether they're getting impactful solutions or solutions that are going to be sustained, working in partnership with them, and then also by proxy working in partnership with the partners that serve them. And by proxy, once again, success from a philanthropic perspective should be the success of the entire impact organization committed to serving these underserved communities. And I think that's something that's easily lost in this sort of philanthropy and funders, where, I mean, there's no doubt that there's work to do in finding really values aligned, really great partners. But once you do that, to the second part of the question, which is why unrestricted funding or unrestricted philanthropy is so important. We believe that's the mechanism to enable a lot of change to happen, and a lot of change, as Shawn was saying, which otherwise in very complex environments, in extremely, extremely complex environments that we're all operating today, otherwise we would not be able to achieve some of the solutions that we're seeing some of the partners in the communities then experience and advocate for. So yeah, that would be my perspective on things.
And I want to go back to something that you shared with us, Pete, as we were all brainstorming on this session, which is that, when you think about it, philanthropy that is still very project focused or restricted is almost riskier than trust-based philanthropy, because we kind of need to shift out of this output industry and really more focused on actual outcomes. And as you mentioned, right, I mean, addressing things like extreme poverty is complex. It's going to require innovation, new approaches. And so, once an organization who has undergone through rigorous due diligence needs to try different ways of addressing this issue, it's really hard to do when you have to make it work within a box. Mm-hmm. And so I thought maybe you could unpack what I thought was a great statement from you, which is, again, that, you know, we could almost think about trust-based philanthropy as being less risky than traditional project financed or project focused, philanthropy.
Yeah, I think that was one of the key decision drivers within our board. And I'm not too sure how many funders are in the room, but I have a feeling that a lot of funders that are turning up to these events already have a really deep appreciation of unrestricted funding, but yet there's obstacles within the internal environment. And so I think the question that we all pose within our internal environment, shift from restricted to unrestricted, is, okay, as a board, like, let's talk about risk. But I think something that doesn't get talked about from a risk perspective, it's all internal risk. So it's like, what's the risk to the funder? What's the risk to the foundation? But if we're actually truly thinking about risk, truly thinking about why we're doing this, we should be thinking holistically about risk, which is actually, what's the risk of not giving unrestrictedly, and what's the risk to the communities? What's the risk to the partners themselves as well? And I think that was a paradigm that we had to grapple with, you know, and there's a paradigm that also you can hold tension with being great stewards, but also ultimately, once again, to that success metrics, being great partners with underserved communities or their impact partners. So yeah, that's been a journey for us. We're not definitely perfect, but I think that was a key catalytic question for us to ask internally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pete. And I want to draw one more parallel before Liz, I'm going to bring it to you, which, you know, I know that Thankyou released a great video that really speaks to this. And this has been a conversation that's been in circles at the Skoll World Forum for some time, which is that when you look at financing in the commercial sector, right, investors buy into a company's vision, values, track record, and team. And then they trust that organization to execute that in a way where then they'll check in and together assess how that's moved the needle on achieving a certain level of transformational impact. And so drawing that parallel with the philanthropic industry, you know, is a really big part of the trust-based philanthropy conversation as well. So we'll definitely circle back with you on that, Pete. But Liz, over to you. You know, as the CEO of IDE, I'd be very curious, and for the whole audience here today, for you to share how this resonates, you know, with you, and particularly how this type of philanthropy just allows us to take the risk that we need to take for the kinds of issues that we're tackling. Would love your thoughts.
Thanks, Alix, and echoing everyone else here, super grateful to be here having this discussion. I think it's so important to be talking about this within the Skoll World Forum and inviting others into the conversation. I think the element of risk and taking chances on new things goes to the heart of trust-based philanthropy. Investing in the vision, values, track record, and team of organizations is critical, really looking at where organizations have had success. So at IDE, our focus is on using market-based solutions to power entrepreneurs to end poverty. And markets are dynamic. The environments that we work in are complex. And it's very difficult to have a point A to point B strategy that you follow straight through. Because if you do that, to your point about Pete, about projects being riskier, you know, you're going to miss your impact. You really have to be able to pivot and change things. And, you know, the point that Shawn, that you made around trying new things is really critical to finding new solutions on how you scale your work to be more efficient and more effective. And so for us, one of the reasons why trust-based philanthropy has helped us to increase our scale of impact and our pace of impact is being able to test out innovative solutions, test out new ideas, and then really leverage that philanthropic capital that has come into our organization with long-term institutional grants that help to then take it up to a further scale. So it becomes a more efficient funding environment and a much more impactful one that is focused on outcomes.
That's great. And Liz, you once, you know, building on what you just shared, I know that you had also previously shared with me and others how we should be looking at impact per dollar invested instead of, the traditional ways in which we kind of look at our impact. It feels like we have a lot of activity reports, right? In our industry, we do a lot of things, but is it really leading to, efficient, again, transformational outcomes? Can you maybe share a little bit more about that, since there's a direct, connection here with trust-based philanthropy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one of my biggest pet peeves is, the number of people impacted. And while scale is incredibly important, the question is impacted how? What is your measurement of impact? And at IDE, we have a metric that we track called social return on investment. And we're really looking at, for every dollar that we're deploying around the world in our programming, and that's across agriculture, water, sanitation and hygiene, and climate resilient circular economy, what is the income increase or the livelihood savings that the clients we work with are achieving, so that we're measuring our own efficiency and our own effectiveness. And we're also measuring, what is that outcome? How is a family's life changed? How is the community landscape changed as a direct result for each dollar that we're spending around the world?
No, that's super helpful. And I think that, this would be one of the things where if this type of thinking was adopted more and more in the mainstream, it would be a game changer. And I think it goes to, maybe one more question I have for you, Liz, before I pivot to Sheila, which is maybe also share with us an example, a specific example in terms of, an entrepreneur you all have worked with where trust-based philanthropy led to success from your perspective.
Yeah, good question. So at a macro level, what I would say is we've been really focused on how can we find the right partners who will partner with us from a trust perspective. And I have to give a shout out to Thankyou, a thank you to Thankyou as one of our partners, because they've invested in the core of IDE and the work we're trying to achieve. And as a result of that, we've been able to create an internal innovation fund. And one of the recent awards that we did through our internal innovation fund is one of our field technicians had this idea of using trichoverma compost as another business product that could be sold to the customers. So they go out into the communities and they're selling seeds and they're selling fertilizers, acting as extension agents, and soil health has a really high correlation with yield outcomes. So we've been able to prototype, how can you do trichoverma compost at scale, add another helpful input into the basket of our field entrepreneurs who are selling inputs, and then have a higher increase in yields at the farm level, which has a direct correlation for the income that's being generated and contributions to food security. And I want to highlight that this is in Nepal, which when COVID hit, the supply chains were completely disrupted. Most of the fertilizers and the seeds were coming in from India and the borders closed down. Now with the war in Ukraine, we're seeing that fertilizer supply chains are disrupted, and the ability to do soil and health amendments right within your own country is huge right now. And that's just one tiny example. It was a grant of $15,000, but now it's being scaled and being applied across all of our programs.
It's really helpful, Liz. Thank you for that. And so Sheila, I think this is a good time to pivot to you because, a big part of the conversations that we've had externally and within this group is that power and equity dynamics, particularly between funders and grantees and even local communities, the people that we're striving to help, is also a really big part of trust-based philanthropy and just how we think about using capital to do good. And so maybe tell us a little bit about Imago Day Fund. And then it would be great to get your perspective on what that balanced equity and power dynamic looks like from your perspective between a funder and a nonprofit.
Sure. Echoing everyone's kind of thanks for kind of pulling us into this conversation. It seems just a great way to kind of wrap up the the experience of Skoll, looking at social entrepreneurs, but also thinking about what trust and how trust kind of drives innovation. But so Imago Day Fund is a family foundation, and we really have tried in the last several years to lean into trust-based philanthropy. And part of that is just recognizing that we are investing in people, and that kind of value of human dignity, both in trying to lift people up and create and support organizations that are helping communities and people thrive and succeed, but also recognizing that the people doing that work also need to be trusted. I think in terms of the power dynamics, I think, we have to be careful that we don't say, okay, great, we're going to practice trust-based philanthropy and all those power imbalances go away, right? There are a couple of things that I kind of circled on my paper, like partnership, and also a journey, that this is a journey where we're trying to move to better systems. And I think it's important to kind of unpack what that means. And one of it is multi-year unrestricted support, which we practice. But it's also really examining the internal structures and how you're giving grants to make sure that your systems aren't burdensome, to make sure that you're creating opportunities to open up conversations with grantees that are not based on whether you're going to get a grant the next year, right? So you're giving that kind of flexibility, and being kind of trying to be in relationship with grantee partners. And that's hard. And it takes kind of intentional work to create opportunities to connect, whether it's around, milestones or work plans or kind of interim opportunities. In addition to our core support, we also offer flex funds for folks to tap into to kind of help strengthen the organization. Again, that opens up opportunities for conversations about what's going on in the organization and where are the places where you maybe need a little more support. Mm-hmm. We also have another fund, which is really core to who we are, called Keep the Spark Alive, that really kind of is meant to support staff. So again, recognizing the work is hard. How do we kind of open up a conversation about what they might be struggling with? And maybe we can provide a small amount of resources to kind of help them implement some practices within their own organization. So I think a lot of it is about trying to be relational, examining kind of internal structures to make sure that they are transparent and not burdensome, and understanding that the power imbalance is there, but we're on a journey to mitigate it as much as we can.
And it makes a great difference. I mean, when you have, again, a funder that comes to you and says, how can I help? Like, help me understand this issue, take me on this journey with you, versus approaching the relationship, with preconceived ideas of how a problem should be solved. Mm-hmm. I certainly know in my experience as well, that's something that I saw was really helpful. And to your point, Sheila, around staff, there was a great study by Open Road Alliance. Again, thank you. This is something that you shared, Pete, the Thankyou team shared in this video, right? There is no evidence to date that links low overheads to high performance, right? That's not anchored in data. So how do we use that again to seed kind of a different culture and approach in philanthropy? So I'm going to take it over to Katie of the African Visionary Fund. And Katie, I think it'd be really helpful to also hear, your perspective on how equity and balanced power dynamics helped achieve greater results, and really help kind of redefine your relationships or your organization's relationships with funders. And maybe tell us a little bit more also about the African Visionary Fund.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to. And also really grateful to be with you all today and on this panel with a lot of people I admire their approach both to the work on the ground and as funders. And I hope that I can provide a kind of unique perspective, because we're both a doer, an impact partner, and a funder ourselves. So the African Visionary Fund is a pooled collaborative fund looking to shift resources and attention to incredible African social change makers on the ground who are often overlooked and underfunded by philanthropy at large. And I think that, we're a 2-year-old fund. We're a baby fund. We just got started in the middle of the pandemic in April 2020. And we've been really lucky to kind of come up in an age in philanthropy where we've been able to raise, $5 million in 2 years, 90% of which is unrestricted funding. And we've had to really center our values in funding conversations frequently to make that happen, and kind of be patient and be willing to say no or ask a funder if we can keep talking about what it would take to move from a slightly restricted partnership to an unrestricted funding partnership, and be willing to pause conversations or ask for more time to work on the partnership with the funder and kind of help them get there. And then I think zooming out a little bit on trust-based philanthropy, something that I think is important to note in these conversations is that even amongst the funders who do have a trust-based approach or kind of use some of these methodologies around unrestricted funding or unburdensome reporting, that's not equally distributed across different types of organizations led by different people. And so when we're talking about equity, we should acknowledge that organizations led by Black people, people of color, and global South leaders consistently get less unrestricted funding than their predominantly white-led peers. And there was a study in the US by Bridgespan that actually was able to quantify that Black-led leaders in the US receive 76% less unrestricted funding. And I think if trust-based philanthropy really is equating unrestricted funding as a currency of trust in philanthropy. And so if we're looking at who is receiving that funding, we can also see who is being trusted by funders the most. And we also know on the flip side of that organizations led by people with lived experience of the challenge they are solving yield even greater results. They often have an easier pathway to impact. They understand their communities and the local dynamics and local government, how to navigate challenges and changing contexts. That was incredibly clear during multiple COVID lockdowns. And so for me, I think I almost want to rebrand trust-based philanthropy sometimes and just call it effective philanthropy. Because oftentimes it's like there's this kind of assumption, or it can be misconstrued as like funders are the ones to give trust. They have the trust, they have the power, they have to give it. But if you're truly trust-based, you also have to be trustworthy as a funder. And that trust has to be earned both ways. And so I think that if we're looking at like, what is the most effective philanthropy, sometimes that term effective philanthropy can get construed as like, as a funder, how do I become the best at discerning what the best organizations are? And when you go down that road as a funder, it can often be laden with bias and assumptions and misperceptions, particularly when you're not a funder based in the communities that you're trying to impact. And I would love to see funders shift to think about, like, my role as a funder, the thing I need to get really good at is moving resources in a way that smooths the path to impact for the people that are actually driving impact. Like oftentimes funders, these things that we're talking about when it's project-based funding or it's hyper-restricted, or the funding relationship or the reporting takes 100 hours over the course of a grant, those things are just creating barriers on the road to impact for that organization. And actually, it's a really bad use of resources for those organizations to have to spend so much time in each funding relationship, their precious staff time, just to like manage those relationships. So that's kind of like where I wish we would go with trust-based philanthropy, is like, this is actually the most effective way as a funder to drive impact, if that's really our ultimate goal. But sometimes it can kind of get mixed up in other goals or other drivers of behavior.
Yeah, and I was going to say we're doing so great on time, so feel free to share all those thoughts because Katie, that's great. So for the remainder of the session, we're gonna call this effective philanthropy. Everybody hashtag effective philanthropy. That's just hugely valuable because I think those are additional layers to this conversation that sometimes get lost, you know, in the ultimate focus of getting more large scale, flexible funding to the right organizations. And then we forget to look at these other inequities, right, that are so embedded in our systems. So it makes me think too that, you know, if we also had more diversity in who's making decisions on where money is allocated, that obviously will also have a big impact. Absolutely, Gannon, hashtag trust is effective. So Katie, without feeling like you have to name anybody, because that's not the purpose of today. But I think that when we're focusing on solutions and the way forward, it's important to unpack what hasn't worked too. You know, I mean, it has to be part of the conversation, as uncomfortable as that might be sometimes. Is there maybe an example you could share with us where there's a funder who didn't live those values and the African Visionary Fund had to work with that funder, and maybe just tell us a little bit more what that was like?
Yeah, that's, you know, I might not name any names specifically, but I will speak broadly. You know, and I think going back to that Open Road Alliance report from a few years ago, there was also that part of the report that said, like, you know, what are the barriers to impact, what gets impact off track, as Open Road likes to say. And I think it was 46% of the time, it's funders, basically. It's some sort of like funder issue, a change in strategy, a delay of getting money out the door to the organization, you know, any kind of like funder issue is really what most consistently gets impact off track. So I think probably there's like endless examples in some ways, because the funders have not been living up to effective philanthropy in this way. And I think, again, because we got off the ground recently, and our kind of ethos, even as a funder ourselves, is very much in this space of we only give multi-year unrestricted funding. We give only to African-led organizations who have the buy-in of the communities they work in on the ground. So we've kind of embedded all of this. But I often hear stories from our partners about their funding relationships that just like blow my mind in not a good way. So we've had like partners say, yeah, I signed a grant agreement, a legal document with a funder for a grant. They told us they would send it on this day, and it's been 6 months and they're not sending it. We're not sure why. They're not responding to our emails, but they are asking for reports on our results for that grant, despite not having actually sent the money yet, and being quite demanding on that front. And that's just wild and disrespectful to me. We've had partners talk about often a funder kind of, and we've had this experience as well, where a funder has said, well, you know, I really like your model, but I just don't like this piece of it. I don't, you know, like, and can you just not do that piece of it because it doesn't align with how I want the work to be done? Or in the case of our partners, they're often told, you know, we'd like you to cut the piece of your work that's community driven because it's inefficient and it's not cost effective, when in fact it's the piece of the model that's actually driving the most sustainable and resilient impact. And often for funders, I think that comes from a place of driving for, which we touched on earlier, driving for numbers over impact. And they're, you know, the thing that's like slowing down, reaching 10,000 people, but transformatively reaching 1,000, a funder will ask an organization to actually cut that part of their model so that they can just get to that 10,000 number that they're after. And, you know, I kind of cut my teeth in this sector early as an M&E consultant. And my first job was in a grassroots organization in Tanzania, and I was their M&E director. And they had 13 different foundation partners. They were a child protection organization. And every single one of those funders had a different log frame, a different M&E indicator matrix, a different reporting schedule, a different type of report template. And it was all for the same core model. And so I was a full-time leadership team member at the organization, and I spent 90% of my time copy and pasting into different funder frameworks. And we're making sure that reports went out on time and trying to, collect information for those reports specifically, and about 10% on helping us as an organization learn from our own data. Again, I just think that's a really inefficient use of resources. And when we working in that organization, that was like our only choice we had at that time to manage those relationships and continue having the resources to drive our work. And at one point I did say, like much chagrin to my colleagues in a funder meeting, I don't think this is an efficient way to use your funding resources. Can we try to combine? Can we produce one report on our work that has the indicators we track because they accurately represent our impact, and all of you can just find the information you need from that one report? And we were able to get maybe like 4 or 5 funders to agree to that, which, decreased the burden a little bit. But again, it's just, it feels so ineffective. And it's, I think if the driving force behind philanthropy was how do we smooth the path to impact, versus like, how do we achieve the thing we have decided in our boardroom we want to achieve, all of this would be extremely common sense across the board.
Absolutely. And that's so helpful, Katie. And I want to build in 2 things. So Liz, you had a point, and Louis, you had a great point in the chat. So hold that thought, Liz, just really quickly. Louis, I think your point is a really good one. How do we get funders to feel like, what are the criteria that are going to make funders more comfortable, right, with doing trust-based philanthropy? And so what is effective due diligence? And then once that due diligence is done, can we ride off into the sunset and learn together, right? Instead of just endlessly doing what might feel like inefficient due diligence. And so your points were, you were offering a few criteria in a chat, which is to understand the strategy and the implementation approach of the organization, making sure that the leadership, right, again, the vision has a really clear and appropriate theory of change and action, and that you trust in the management, right, that there's the governance, there's information that speaks to the governance of the organization, and we mean ethical governance, and then of course that the organization is good at learning. And honestly, can we say that all of those things are always met in the business world, and yet there's so much financing that goes to startups that don't necessarily meet all those criteria, and yet as nonprofits there are so many who meet that criteria, and yet it's so hard to get funders to see that. So we still have a bit of work to do, but building on those great points from Louis, Liz, I'm going to hand it over to you because you had something to say. And I think Pete, you also had something to say. So Liz, go ahead.
Thanks, Alix. I wanted to build off what Katie said about smoothing the path to impact. I love that phrase, Katie, and if I can, I'm going to borrow it and use it many, many times. But I think, building off your point about, precious staff time going to maintaining relationships with donors and to filling out the proposal formats that need to go in, whether it's an expression of interest or it's the due diligence forms. I think another piece that's not talked about often, and is an example of ineffective philanthropy, is you have multiple organizations applying for the same amount of limited funds. So you have organizations that are understaffed, under-resourced, using precious staff time to apply for these proposals. And in the end, the amount of time and money and effort that goes into the proposals is less than the amount of money that comes out from the funder. So that is a case of like pulling staff and organizations off mission in order to compete for scarce funds. And that's rarely talked about. So one, how do we bring in more philanthropic capital? How do we make it more effective? And then I think another contradiction that I find, and again, this is more around the proposals to foundations, is oftentimes donors don't want to fund those staff who do the proposal writing, but at the same time, funders want to make sure you have a lot of different sources of funding so that they're not the only funder funding you.
Right.
So there's an inability or unwillingness to fund the staff time to do that work, to get additional funds, have that full portfolio of funding so that you are seen as an acceptable risk. And then, it's just this like constant contradiction that we face. And I think it's particularly challenging the smaller of an organization that you are. And you really have to spend time thinking, do we even have the bandwidth to go after this? What might our chances be? And if you can't get access to the decision makers within that foundation, you have a pretty small chance of winning. So there's a lot of areas that we can shape up to really improve and ensure that we do have effective philanthropy.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great point, Liz. Pete, it's going to be another hashtag, ineffective philanthropy. So Pete, over to you for your thoughts on these comments.
Yeah, we should have definitely planned this out before. I'm going to jump back to Lewis's comment as well. So sorry about the zigzagging. But yeah, I think Lewis, 3 reflections on that note. One is I actually had a conversation with another corporate philanthropic foundation, and it was just really surprising to both of us, and not that we are experts at the field as well, but we're seeing a growing move towards corporate giving, which is great, but a growing movement of corporate giving that is underpinned by people who are marketing experts. And they're the ones that are giving sort of money away. And I think to your first point around, like, how do we create conditions which funders are really comfortable with? One reflection is, would funders who are of a marketing background or of a background that isn't about sustainable development, would they ever feel comfortable with unrestricted funding? And I think that's a look internally on whoever's managing these philanthropic endeavors to go, are we putting the right people in the right position, as a first thought. The second thought is, in terms of understanding strategy and approach, we're still grappling with this internally, where there could be an organization which works at all systems levels, so your macro, meso, micro levels, and have multiple approaches as well, which for to your point, Alix, does it make sense if we wait until we understand all of the different approaches and all the different evidence and all the different theories of changes, plus contributionary, attributionary, causationary, like impacts and effects? For us, we actually took what we call, these test funds, where in order for us to learn a bit more about these organizations, we gave unrestricted funds, and we committed to going on a learning journey as a funder for 12 months instead of doing due diligence on a partner for 12 months without them getting money. And I think that's something, as a, if we're talking about effective philanthropy, and also combining that with parallels of the business world, can we sort of look internally and say, would we pay for a consultant's time? Would we not pay for a consultant's time to get to know someone? Where's that thinking coming from? So that's another sort of internal journey that we've looked at. And probably the third one would be around the fact that, all of these criteria, and I would sort of add a bit more on the macro level, how the macro level systems change and how that's actually really unlocked with unrestricted funding. I think that's a conversation that I would feel many people who are pivoting towards this unrestricted funding should be thinking about how we create the best bang for buck, but particularly within macro level contributionary systems and effect change in that sense. And that's where we also see a lot of the power of unrestricted funding, or the power of effective philanthropy in that sense. And Lewis, you've raised your hand.
But before we go to you, I love it. Everybody's super engaged. This is what we wanted. Pete, when you all went on this learning journey, I think it would be, can you share with us an example of something you learned?
Yes, lots of things and we're still learning. Feel free to consult I would say if anyone on the Q&A wants to make this spicier as well, you can consult with Liz, Katie, and Shawn, who are also our grantees and Impact partners. We can do a live performance, a 360 performance update for people, but we're still on this learning journey. One of the biggest things that I think we've learned is these seemingly immovable obstacles for us to transition from a restricted to an unrestricted funder. One of them was the fact that we were a CPG company, and we still are, sorry. And the fact that our consumers really are micro donors, and there's real risk. Like when we talk about risk, there's commercial risk for our organization if our consumers no longer trust us, backers, and therefore provide funding, this funding stream to our partners. And we really hesitated internally to change our model because of that fact. But when we did, one of maybe the key takeaway points is always challenge assumptions, and for us, when we did do that, the last 2 years, we haven't seen a decrease in sales. We haven't seen a decrease in net promoter scores, which measures trust. We haven't seen a decrease in also our consumer sentiment and brand sentiment. In fact, it's been quite the opposite, where people have read the communications and have read the reasoning. And we've done a bit of communications. There's a report, a 6,000 word report that we've written. There's a video that we've released as well. So we've both got the comms catering to the head, the people that are led by head decisions, and also people that are led by heart decisions. And we've sort of made that sort of unrestricted journey really transparent in those two groups of people. And yeah, I think that's been a learning for us, which is challenge the assumptions, challenge the assumptions that hold us back. And when you execute it, do it in a way which is really authentic, really meaningful, and put a lot of heart into it, plus a lot of, I would say, brain power into communicating that. So you can take internal and external stakeholders on that journey.
Absolutely. And I think it goes to a point I was thinking about as everybody was speaking, which is, I think sometimes it would also be good to share a comparison, right? Like if this amount of money had gone into, funding a set of project-based endeavors, and it was all restricted funding, here's what we would anticipate the impact would have been. And instead, unrestricted funding allowed an organization to achieve this set of impact, and look at those comparisons. I mean, again, we can't boil everything always to numbers. I think that's a whole other conversation we could have. But I think sometimes that's something that's missing. And it goes to a point that Joanne Sonnenschein made, which is a really great one. Which is, have we floated around the idea of having a universal proposal, right? So once someone has done a 70-page proposal for a funder, can this get passed around to all the other funders? Or, I mean, I don't know, is there kind of a universal proposal concept that would reduce just so many of the inefficiencies, Liz, that you spoke to, and others on the panel? And to tackle that, I want to just bring back one panelist who hasn't had a chance to say much, which is Shawn, of Raising the Village. There you are. Is there anything you want to say to that?
Well, I think that, it's interesting when we think about the space and some of the conversation that's happened so far. What's something when I speak to our peers that are grant officers and understand what's going on, is that I often hear about the fear to make a mistake or to have a miss when it comes to picking prospective grantees or being able to make decisions on those. And sometimes there's a conversation that perhaps could be very helpful, is to understand that even though everyone's trying their best, it's possible that we won't be perfect 100% of the time. And I think that's a great place to start, because it changes the conversation that team members are able to have with prospective grantees when it comes to saying, well, that's great, we're going to talk about this specific aspect of this part of the proposal that we're thinking about, but what are other things that you think would help move the needle, or would really change or advance the program or the work, or really encourage that type of dialogue when it comes to effective philanthropy?
Absolutely. And Shawn, I'm going out of order here, but I also didn't give you a chance to share a little bit about what Raising the Village does. And I just want to give you a few minutes to maybe share with us your work.
Sure, I'll do it's at the back end, so I'll do a brief one. And essentially what we do is we work in the intersection of community-driven development and data analytics. So we're partnering with communities in last mile remote areas of Uganda, primarily the ultra poor, so those living under 50 cents a day. And what we do is working with the communities and a number of partners, including the government. What we do is we do an accelerated program that allows us to pinpoint what are the key levers that will accelerate household income from 50 cents up to $2 within 24 months. And so with that, we pick up quite a bit of traction in a short period of time.
Fantastic. So I'm going to open it back up to all the panelists. And Louis, we know you had your hand up. If you can put your comment in the chat, that would be great. I was going to say, I really appreciate how engaged, well, we appreciate how engaged the audience is. This is for you. So let's keep it going. Some really, really great comments in the chat. I think there was also one by Heather Graham. What's the interest of using GuideStar or something like it as a place where we, funders get the information they need rather than orgs providing it to each potential funder? Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to, could there be a way for this information or standards that nonprofits work hard to get as kind of a signal of excellence to be used across the space and unlock more unrestricted funding? And maybe I'm going to tie it to a question I actually had for all the panelists, which is, based on the conversation we had today, so what will it take, right, for effective philanthropy to become the mainstream? Because we know how hugely valuable it is. I'm going to ask each of you to go one at a time to share your thoughts on that. And Liz, you are on my right, so we're going to go first with you.
Thanks, Alix. I think my recommendation to philanthropists is really to fully embrace that trust-based philanthropy encourages both innovation and accelerates scaling of impact. And to the point of risk-taking, that there's really valuable learning in failure that leads to more successful outcomes at the end. So both encouraging innovation, accelerating scale of impact, and that risk-taking and failure lead to greater results over time.
Fantastic. Sheila, over to you.
I would completely agree with what Liz just said. And I would also add on this notion of kind of the application. I would encourage foundations and philanthropists to really examine the information that they need. IDF went through that process. I can't take any credit for it because I joined the organization after that happened, but really interrogating what was needed so that if there was information that we could get ourselves, there's no reason to ask a grantee or potential grantee partner to kind of go through the process of filling out kind of long reports in our format. Instead, the burden is shifted more onto the program partner to do that work. And then to Shawn's point, one of the things that we do to kind of really open up the conversation around strategy and priorities is the bulk of that kind of application is kind of conversations that we have with the grantee partner around their strategy, their vision, what keeps them up at night, what they're hoping for, what unrestricted dollars would help them achieve in a very open-ended way so that you can kind of dig in and really understand what's going on with the organization.
Fantastic.
So I would say interrogate your systems and the kind of the process behind it.
Fantastic. Pete, over to you.
Yeah, echoing and building off what Sheila was saying, I think from a funding perspective, and maybe looking internally as well, what were some of the key decision drivers that switched us from being restricted to unrestricted? And there's a theme around communication, and there's a theme around influencing change internally. And that's something that isn't easy. And I would say everyone in the room is masterclass experts at influencing internal stakeholders. And for us, it was the sense of, hey, what were the key themes that a lot of our internal decision makers, including myself, needed to make? And a simple couple of thoughts would be tying it back to an organization's values, and also tying back to the purpose and the why of the philanthropic endeavor that you're in. And I think when you have those two pillars, you can make any case and any argument internally to your board or to other internal stakeholders and managers, which is hopefully practical and not this ethereal, nebulous concept of, hey, we need to be unrestricted because it's better for the world. You know, actually tying it back to your internal culture, internal values, and also your internal why of your philanthropic endeavors. I think it's a really powerful communication tool. So that will be my quick thought.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pete. Katie, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. What will it take? Because I feel like as long as I kind of like accidentally fell into philanthropy in 2016, and this was a conversation then and is still a conversation now. And I think that when you think about, we talk a lot about systems change. I think that's like a growing thing across the development sector in these different, in education systems, in health systems. I think we need to take a systems lens to philanthropy and have entities that are driving philanthropic systems change, because we're often like talking about it, but funders have very few incentives to actually change this way, very little accountability to drive them to change their practices in this way. And so I think there's a growing number of organizations whose focus in some ways is actually on driving philanthropic change and change in the way the philanthropic system operates. And they need investment. And obviously the African Visionary Fund, that's a piece of our model. We call it the play the game, change the game balance. How do we move millions of dollars now to incredible locally led organizations to drive impact in their communities, while also fundamentally shifting the way philanthropy interacts with those organizations and thinks about impact on the African continent. And I would encourage everyone, I'll throw it in the chat. There's a great report from Bridgespan that came out a few months ago about the power of collaborative funds as a way for funders to more efficiently drive resources, particularly in regions and sectors and areas where they don't have expertise or lived experience on their team. And I think that's really the future of philanthropy.
Fantastic. And then Shawn, over to you. 2 minutes.
Sounds good. I'll stay within that. And so I think whenever we get into these conversations, I think with effective philanthropy, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a carte blanche. I think that needs to be a level of communication and understanding of where else would it, what does the unrestricted look like? And opening up that conversation to say, okay, we see where this program is going. What else do you think will really advance the work? What will make this effective? I think that creating a space where things can be tangible, they can be clear, and there can be a dialogue and a conversation. I think that's where we'll start to see a stronger bond between different groups. And I think that's the way forward. And in saying taking small steps doesn't need to be this full cut over on the next day, but how do we open up the conversation and the communication internally and with our partners about how what does this actually look like?
Fantastic. Well, I think we could have gone for a whole other hour. This is really what we wanted. I really want to thank again our incredible panelists, everybody who spent this Friday afternoon or evening or morning, based on where you are in the world, with us on this really important topic. I think that we can agree that there's a lot of momentum here, and we are at this unique moment in time where this type of philanthropic approach can absolutely make its way in the mainstream and still uphold, the level of rigor around the impact that, we all want to have. And that entails making more room, right, for innovation, less inefficiencies around these endless proposal cycles. This concept of a universal proposal is great. Rethinking how we are measuring impact, and anchoring these partnerships around trust and power dynamics that reflect the kind of change that we want to have in the world. So on this note, I also highly recommend that you all watch the Thankyou donor dysfunction video. It will leave you inspired on a Friday afternoon. But thank you for being with us today, and we are officially wrapping up. Thanks, everybody.